Some mysteries bleed not from wounds, but from canvases. It begins with a troubled aristocrat who swears his grandfather's portrait weeps crimson tears, each night more vivid than the last, stirring whispers of curses and ruin. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step into the hush of Baker Street, where Holmes waits to peel back illusion from truth. Let us follow him into the mystery of the bleeding portrait. It was upon one of those evenings when the London fog hung low and dense, pressing against the windows of Baker Street like a shroud, that I found my friend in one of his most restless humours. Holmes had spent the day in idleness, save for an erratic series of bursts upon his violin, each more discordant than the last, and had now resorted to pacing the room with the air of a caged panther. His eyes burned with that peculiar light, which I had come to associate with the expectancy of some intellectual diversion. I attempted to distract him with the day's newspaper, but he brushed it aside with a curt gesture. "The events of the world, Watson," said he, "are a pale entertainment compared with the theatre of the human heart." It was plain he longed for a case worthy of his peculiar talents. As if in answer to Holmes's unspoken craving, there came a knock at the street door, low, hesitant, yet bearing that peculiar insistence which betrays urgency wrapped in fear. Mrs. Hudson, after a brief parley in the hall, ushered into our sitting room a tall figure wrapped in a heavy travelling cloak, the collar turned high and the hat pressed low upon the brow. The man paused upon the threshold as though debating flight, then advanced with the reluctant step of one driven by necessity. Holmes, who had thrown himself languidly into his chair, regarded the visitor with a glance keen as a rapier's thrust, while I, more moved by the tremor of the man's hand upon the doorknob, felt at once that we were in the presence of a soul in distress. "Pray be seated, sir," Holmes murmured, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. The stranger cast aside his cloak and hat with a movement that betrayed both haste and apprehension. He was a man of no great age, yet the lines upon his brow and the pallor of his cheeks spoke of anxieties too heavy for his years. His eyes darted about the room, pausing uneasily upon every shadowed corner, as though he feared an unseen pursuer might be lurking there. When at last he addressed us, it was in a voice that faltered like a failing instrument. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "you may think me fanciful, but I come upon a matter so strange, so utterly unaccountable, that it has shaken my reason to its core." He clasped his gloved hands tightly together, as if to still their trembling. Even before a word more was spoken, I knew we were on the threshold of one of Holmes's most curious inquiries. As the gentleman spoke, I could not but note the smudge of some reddish stain upon the cuff of his right sleeve, though whether of earth or paint I could not tell. His glove, too, showed the faintest wear, as though it had been pressed repeatedly against a hard surface. Yet while these trifles occupied my limited powers of observation, Holmes's gaze travelled over the man from crown to heel with the rapidity and precision of a surgeon's scalpel. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, his lips compressed into that faint smile which betrayed the stirrings of amusement. I recognized in that expression the sure sign that my friend had already seized upon some clue invisible to my duller senses. "You have not come to us upon a whim," Holmes remarked at length, "but upon a matter in which secrecy and fear walk hand in hand. Am I right?" The removal of the cloak revealed a figure of striking presence. The man stood tall, with the bearing of one accustomed to deference, though his countenance betrayed no peace of mind. His attire, while of good quality, had been hastily arranged, and there clung to him that air of dishevelled anxiety which no station in life can conceal. His dark hair was swept back from a high brow, and his lips quivered with the effort to maintain composure. "My name is Lionel Fairchild," he announced, with the tone of one who expects recognition. I had, indeed, heard the name in connection with a respectable lineage and a small but distinguished art collection. "You will, I trust, pardon this intrusion, but I have come upon a matter which has robbed me of sleep and left me at my wits' end. I am not a man of weak nerves, yet the experience of these past nights would have shaken the stoutest courage. Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly, his grey eyes fixed upon our visitor with quiet scrutiny. "Pray proceed, Mr. Fairchild," he murmured. "You will find us attentive, and perhaps, if fortune allows, of some assistance." Fairchild drew a deep breath before continuing, his voice low and charged with suppressed agitation. "In the great hall of my family seat at Hampstead hangs a portrait of my grandfather, Sir Reginald Fairchild, a man whose sternness of countenance was matched only by the severity of his rule within our household. The painting, executed in oils by a noted artist of his day, has long been an object of pride, yet of late it has become the source of the most appalling terror." He clasped his hands together until the knuckles whitened. "3 nights past, as I passed through the gallery, I observed, to my astonishment, that from the eyes of the portrait there seemed to issue the faintest streaks of red. I dismissed it as some trick of the light. But on the following night, the streaks had deepened and lengthened, resembling rivulets of blood upon the canvas. Last evening they had grown so vivid, so hideously lifelike, that even the servants fled the hall in alarm." He paused, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief. "I am not a credulous man, Doctor Watson, nor am I one to put faith in idle tales of curses. Yet I confess that when confronted with such an unholy spectacle, reason falters. I can neither explain it, nor endure the scandal which must ensue should it become widely known." Holmes raised his brows a fraction. "A portrait that bleeds," he said softly, with the faintest trace of irony. "That is, indeed, a novelty in art." Fairchild's agitation deepened as he spoke of the human consequences of this phenomenon. "Already the household is in uproar. The maids cross themselves at every mention of the gallery, and the footmen mutter of a curse that clings to the Fairchild name. My fiancée, Miss Catherine Blythe, is of a more practical disposition, yet even she has been shaken. She has told me plainly that unless the matter is resolved and the spectre laid to rest, she cannot, in conscience, bind her future to a family haunted by such abominations." I could not but pity the man, for his distress was genuine, and in his haggard features one saw the shadow of sleepless nights. Holmes, however, displayed no more emotion than if he had been considering a problem in mathematics. "Superstition is a convenient refuge, Watson," he remarked coolly, "when ignorance prefers marvels to explanations. Pray continue, sir." Fairchild shifted uneasily, yet Holmes's gaze grew sharper. "Before we proceed further," said my friend, "permit me a liberty." Rising, he walked slowly round our visitor, his eyes darting from one point to another with the unerring instinct of a hawk. "You are a man who values appearances, yet your glove betrays long use upon a cane, and your limp is not from birth, but from an injury sustained within the year. The smear upon your collar is vermilion paint, not blood, and it has transferred faintly to your cuff. Lastly, you have come from Hampstead directly, yet paused at a studio before presenting yourself here. Am I in error?" Fairchild stared, his jaw slack, as though Holmes had conjured spirits to whisper his secrets. I confess I too was startled, though I had noticed the limp and assumed it a permanent affliction. "You are correct in every particular," said the gentleman at last, his voice hoarse with astonishment. "How you arrive at such knowledge surpasses me." Holmes smiled faintly. "It is a trifle, my dear sir, though trifles you may find form the foundation of truth. Now, to the heart of your difficulty." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers once more steepled beneath his chin. "You have not, however, told us all. It is not in your nature to be wholly frank. You spoke of a family pride in the portrait, yet you have omitted mention of a quarrel that has left its mark more deeply than any pigment upon canvas. Your uncle, perhaps." The colour rose suddenly to Fairchild's cheeks, betraying him more surely than words. "It is true," he admitted after a painful pause. "My uncle and I have been at odds, over certain matters of inheritance. He contends that portions of the estate should, by right, fall to him, while my grandfather's will favours my branch of the family. The bitterness between us has grown sharp. Yet I had no wish to burden you with these sordid details." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "On the contrary, such details are seldom sordid, but often essential. Greed and fear, Mr. Fairchild, are more reliable agents than any phantom. We shall see which of them is at work here." I felt a chill pass through me at Holmes's words, for in that instant it seemed the case had shifted from the realm of superstition into that of human malice. The following afternoon found Holmes and myself seated in a hired carriage, with Mr. Lionel Fairchild opposite us as we made our way northward to Hampstead. The city's clamour gradually gave way to the quieter lanes, where the autumn fog hung low across the hedgerows and fields. Our companion maintained a sombre silence, broken only by the occasional restless movement of his hands upon his cane. Holmes, on the other hand, reclined with eyes half closed, as if in indifference, though I observed the slight tapping of his fingers against his knee, a sign I had come to recognise as evidence of keen activity of thought. "You will find me a poor host," Fairchild remarked suddenly, his voice betraying the strain of his anxiety. "You mistake yourself, sir," Holmes replied with dry amusement. "We go not for hospitality, but for truth, and truth, in my experience, has never yet provided comfortable lodgings." Fairchild Manor loomed before us with the imposing gravity of centuries. Within, he led us directly to the great hall, where the object of dread commanded the wall above the mantelpiece. It was, indeed, a formidable likeness, the visage of Sir Reginald Fairchild, rendered with such uncompromising detail that one felt the eyes followed one across the room. The face was austere, the lips compressed into a line that bespoke severity of judgment. Yet it was not the grim expression that drew my gaze, but the two crimson streaks that trailed from the eyes, meandering down the painted cheeks like tears of blood. A chill passed through me at the sight, for the effect was grotesquely lifelike. Fairchild crossed himself almost unconsciously. "You see, gentlemen," he whispered, "it has grown worse." Holmes stepped closer, his keen gaze travelling over the canvas and frame with swift exactness. He touched the streaks lightly with a finger, and then held it to the light. "Pigment," he muttered, "and fresh." He stood in silence for a time, studying not the portrait itself, but the edges, the fittings, and the wall upon which it hung. His lips curved in that faint smile of amusement which usually preceded some remarkable discovery. Holmes's examination of the portrait was as methodical as a surgeon's dissection. He drew a small magnifying lens from his pocket, passing it swiftly along the frame. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, beckoning me closer. "These streaks do not appear in the full light of day, but under the softer glow of evening lamps their illusion is heightened. A clever contrivance. Note, too, the faint odour, unmistakably turpentine. I bent nearer and perceived it plainly. Furthermore," Holmes continued, "this panel of flooring beneath the portrait shows the faintest scrape mark, as though a ladder or stand had been placed here of late. One does not require a fertile imagination to conclude that the so-called miracle is but the result of human industry." Fairchild stared at him in astonishment. "You mean it is deliberate? That some villain dares to tamper with my family's heritage?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "The world is more full of villains than phantoms, sir. Let us descend to those who serve you. They often know more than they dare to say." In the servants' quarters I found the household in an unmistakable state of disquiet. The maids spoke in hushed tones, whispering of the curse of Sir Reginald, whose stern gaze could not rest even in death. One insisted she had seen the streaks brighten of their own accord. Another swore she heard footsteps in the gallery at night when no living soul was abroad. They eyed me with suspicion, as though I too might be an agent of some uncanny power. Meanwhile, Holmes remained silent, standing in the doorway, his eyes darting from face to face. At length he remarked quietly, "Curious. Those who speak most of curses are those who least dare to look upon the portrait." I saw, indeed, that two of the staff avoided even glancing in the direction of the hall, while another crossed himself whenever it was mentioned. Holmes made no comment beyond a nod, but I recognized in his manner that he had filed away the observation for later use. In the course of our inquiries, Holmes contrived to draw Mr. Fairchild aside, and by a few adroit questions touched upon matters of family history. It was then, with a reluctance palpable in every word, that Fairchild disclosed a darker chapter of his house. Sir Reginald, it appeared, had in his later years cast off his second son, charging him with profligacy and dishonour. This unhappy man, deprived alike of patrimony and respect, had lived obscurely until his death some years past, leaving behind a single child, a cousin to our client. That cousin, Mr. Fairchild admitted, had grown to manhood under the shadow of resentment. Though never openly hostile, his bearing had been marked by a sullen reserve and the quiet bitterness of one who feels himself wronged by fate. It required little imagination to see how such a man, denied inheritance yet ever conscious of its nearness, might be tempted to sinister devices. Holmes listened without interruption, his expression inscrutable. "Blood has long memories," he observed at last, "and grudges longer still. I should like to make the acquaintance of this cousin of yours, Mr. Fairchild. For though a man's silence may seem harmless, it often conceals more than his words would ever dare reveal." We returned presently to the hall, where the grim portrait still brooded over us, its crimson streaks mocking all pretense of naturalness. I confess the sight weighed heavily upon me, yet Holmes appeared singularly untouched by its horror. He paced once round the chamber, his gaze wandering to the corners, the windows, and the floor, as though assembling in his mind the various fragments of a puzzle. At length he paused before the fire, his hands thrust into the pockets of his coat, and regarded our client with that cool detachment which so often disconcerted the most forthright witness. "Your cousin, Mr. Fairchild," said he quietly, "is a man whose position gives him motive enough for mischief, though not necessarily the means. I shall not yet accuse him, for to do so without proof would be folly. Still," here his eyes gleamed with sudden sharpness, "there are marks in this affair which suggest a closer hand at work." Fairchild, bewildered, demanded an explanation, but Holmes waved it aside. "Patience, sir. The truth is seldom caught by pursuit, but often comes to heel when least expected. Meanwhile, Watson and I will remain vigilant." I noted the tone, for I had long since learned that when Holmes chose to withhold his conclusions, it was never from ignorance, but because he had already seen what the rest of us must wait to discover. Holmes's attention, which had lingered upon the sombre portrait, now shifted to the wall itself. With a sudden motion, he drew a thin blade from his pocket and ran it delicately along the inner edge of the frame. A faint click answered the gesture, and to my astonishment, the panel yielded slightly. "There, Watson," said he softly, prizing it open, "is the hand that bleeds." Behind the canvas lay a narrow cavity, no larger than a man's arm. Within it, we discerned a small glass phial, half filled with a viscous red liquid, and beside it, a crude brush, stiff with pigment. The odour of turpentine rose at once, mingled with a sickly taint, unmistakable to one of medical training. "Animal blood," I murmured, recoiling. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "mixed with pigment to give permanence. Each night a small portion was contrived to trickle through fine apertures cunningly pierced in the paint. Thus the illusion of tears." Fairchild groaned aloud, leaning heavily upon the mantel. "Then it is no curse, but villainy." Holmes closed the panel with a decisive snap. "Curses rarely leave the scent of turpentine behind them," he observed. "We may dismiss the supernatural, but not, I fear, the human hand that placed these devices." At once Fairchild's thoughts flew to the enemy nearest to his heart. "It must be my cousin," he cried, pacing the hall with feverish energy. "Who else has motive enough? He has brooded for years upon the injustice of his father's disinheritance. Who else would dare profane our household with such monstrous trickery?" Holmes regarded him with that cool detachment, which never failed to exasperate the overwrought. "Convenience, my dear sir," he said quietly, "is a dangerous guide. The man who stands foremost in suspicion is often placed there by design." Fairchild turned upon him in protest. "You cannot deny he bears me ill will. No man in England has greater cause to wish me discredited." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied with a shrug. "But motive alone is no more proof than a shadow is substance. Let us not hasten to accuse the cousin until we have tested the strength of this chain." He spoke with such calm assurance that even I, who had shared Fairchild's suspicions, felt my confidence shaken. There was in Holmes's tone a note which told me he already looked elsewhere for the true hand behind the bleeding portrait. That same evening, while Fairchild poured forth renewed accusations, Holmes's gaze wandered idly to the staircase leading from the gallery. He stooped suddenly, plucking a pale fibre from the polished banister, and held it against the lamplight. "A thread of silk," said he, "from a lady's glove." Fairchild frowned. "Impossible. No woman of the household would set foot in that accursed chamber." Holmes's lips twitched in that half-smile which so often heralded a revelation. "And yet, Mr. Fairchild, here is the evidence of such a presence. Observe the faint mark left upon the polish where a gloved hand rested for support. It is recent, within the day." I could not restrain my exclamation. "But your fiancée herself declared she never approached the gallery." Holmes inclined his head. "Declarations are cheap, Watson. Gloves are not so obliging. Our lady has been less scrupulous than her words suggest. The inconsistency betrays her." Fairchild's expression darkened with dismay. "Catherine, you cannot mean—" "I mean nothing," Holmes interrupted sharply. "I merely state that her testimony falters before physical fact. Whether she be actress or victim, we shall learn soon enough. Until then, let us hold our tongues and sharpen our wits." He pocketed the thread, and I knew from the gleam in his eyes that the case, which had seemed so bound in curses and family quarrels, was about to take a turn more startling still. Holmes, having secured the telltale fibre, turned once more to the panel behind the portrait. "There is no sorcery here, Watson," said he, "only artifice. Observe the design, a small reservoir, a tube leading through the canvas, and a contrivance for release. Each night, a fresh measure of blood mixed with pigment trickles outward, giving the ghastly illusion of tears. Ingenious, perhaps, but by no means supernatural." Fairchild groaned and covered his face with his hands. "Then I have been duped, fooled like a child into believing in ghosts." Holmes raised a hand. "You are not alone, sir. Mankind has ever preferred the marvellous to the mundane. But let us not linger on the contrivance itself. Consider its purpose. Why would any sane person devise such theatrics? To terrify you, Mr. Fairchild, until fear or ridicule compelled you to renounce your inheritance. The means may be grotesque, but the motive is as old as Cain." I could not but shudder, for the explanation robbed the portrait of its mystery, only to replace it with the darker certainty of human malice. "Whoever arranged this," Holmes continued, "possessed not only access to the gallery, but also the audacity to risk discovery. That narrows the field considerably." He paused, his eyes resting keenly upon our client. "Your enemies are not spectral, Mr. Fairchild. They walk upon 2 feet, and they know your household well." Fairchild, still trembling, muttered of his cousin's sullen resentment, but Holmes silenced him with an impatient gesture. "We have spoken enough of your cousin. He is too convenient a villain. When the obvious answer presents itself too readily, it is often because another hand has contrived to place him there." "Then who?" Fairchild demanded, his voice thick with desperation. Holmes paced slowly across the hall, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider, Watson, what is required. Access to the gallery when others are absent, familiarity with the household's rhythms, means of introducing paint, pigment and blood without arousing suspicion, and, above all, motive strong enough to brave exposure." My mind groped vainly at these conditions, but Holmes's eyes gleamed with that cold fire of certainty which I had come to dread and admire in equal measure. "You suggest someone nearer than the cousin?" I asked. "Nearer still," Holmes replied gravely. "So near that his name scarcely crosses your lips in suspicion. Yet it is precisely in such quarters that the keenest dangers often lie." He spoke no further, leaving both Fairchild and myself staring at him in bewildered silence. That night, as we took our leave of the gallery, I pressed Holmes to reveal the meaning of his words. "Surely," I urged, "you have already discerned the hand behind this infernal masquerade. Why then leave Fairchild in torment?" Holmes lit his pipe with deliberate calm, the flare of the match throwing sharp lines across his ascetic features. "Because, Watson, conjecture is not proof. One may suspect the archer, but without the arrow in his quiver, the suspicion is naught but fancy. I intend to test a small theory, nothing more. Until then, silence is our ally." His tone admitted no further inquiry, yet I could not repress a sigh of frustration. "You will drive me mad with your riddles, Holmes." He gave a short laugh. "Better madness than error, my dear fellow. For while an error may be excused in medicine, in detection it is fatal." With that he strode ahead into the foggy night, leaving me to follow, puzzled, exasperated, and yet with that secret thrill which always accompanied the sense that my companion had glimpsed truths invisible to my own sight. At Holmes's insistence, the household was summoned to the gallery at the stroke of midnight. The great hall lay shrouded in shadow, the stern visage of Sir Reginald looming above us with a grim authority that seemed almost alive. A chill pervaded the chamber, less from the air than from the nervous anticipation which held each of us in its grip. Fairchild paced restlessly, casting anxious glances towards the portrait. His cousin stood stiffly apart, his face a mask of sullen defiance, while Miss Blythe maintained a studied composure that to my eye seemed somewhat too deliberate. The servants huddled at the far end, whispering among themselves in voices hushed with awe. Holmes alone appeared untroubled. He had placed himself in a high-backed chair directly opposite the painting, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unwavering. "We shall now permit our phantom to perform," he remarked dryly. "It has been punctual these last nights. I have no doubt it will oblige us again." The tension in that room was unbearable. I confess my own nerves were strained to breaking, for though my reason assured me that no supernatural agency was at work, the sight of that dreadful canvas in the dim light filled me with a most uncomfortable expectancy. Not a soul stirred as the minutes crept past. Only the ticking of the clock broke the silence. Holmes sat as still as the portrait itself, a figure of calm in the midst of suspense. Then, as the hour struck, a faint gasp arose from the servants, and all eyes fixed upon the painted face of Sir Reginald. Slowly, with hideous certainty, fresh streaks of red began to trickle from the eyes of the portrait. The effect was ghastly in the extreme. Against the pallid face of the old knight, the lines seemed like tears of blood weeping from beyond the grave. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. Miss Blythe clasped her hands tightly together, her composure faltering for the first time. "Heaven preserve us," she whispered. The cousin muttered something beneath his breath, his features distorted with mingled fear and anger. Fairchild himself cried out in horror, covering his face as if to shield himself from the dreadful spectacle. For my own part, though I had long since surrendered belief in anything supernatural, I confess I felt my heart hammering against my ribs with almost painful force. The illusion was so perfect, the timing so precise, that it was difficult not to yield, if only for an instant, to the dreadful thought of a curse fulfilled. Holmes, however, remained motionless. His eyes gleamed with the fire of triumph, and a faint smile played upon his lips. "Our phantom grows theatrical," he said in a low voice, "but its stagecraft is poor, for the strings are already visible." As if in answer to his words, a droplet fell from the canvas onto the hearth below, staining the stone with its crimson hue. Fairchild staggered forward, as though to confront the apparition himself. Holmes raised a restraining hand. "Patience, sir. The moment of revelation is upon us. Let the ghost finish its performance before we unmask the actor." The silence deepened once more, broken only by the slow drip of that infernal liquid. It was then that Holmes, with sudden energy, sprang from his chair. With a single bound, Holmes reached the portrait. His hand darted behind the frame, and with a sharp tug, he revealed a thin glass tube, cunningly concealed along its inner edge. From this, the crimson liquid trickled drop by drop, fed by a small reservoir secreted within the panel. "Gentlemen," cried Holmes, his voice ringing through the hall, "behold the bleeding heart of your phantom!" A murmur of astonishment rose from the company. Fairchild uttered a cry of relief, while the cousin flushed darkly, as though the shame of detection fell upon him. Miss Blythe, however, grew pale as ivory, her eyes fixed upon Holmes with an intensity that betrayed some inward terror. Holmes continued his examination with swift precision. He traced the tube to a hidden aperture in the wall panelling, which he pressed sharply. A section yielded, disclosing a narrow recess wherein lay several files, brushes, and a rag steeped in the unmistakable odour of turpentine. "It is no miracle," Holmes said coldly. "It is the work of human cunning, and of no mean order. But the hand that placed these here miscalculated one thing. That deceit, however artful, must always leave its spoor. And tonight, with all present as witnesses, the spoor leads directly to its owner." At this he turned, his eyes sweeping the company with a gaze that froze each in place. For an instant, no one breathed, the air taut with expectation. Then Holmes's lips curved into that enigmatic smile I knew so well. "The ghost is laid," said he, "but the true culprit remains to be unmasked. That, my dear Watson, shall be our task before this night is done." The moment Holmes exposed the hidden contrivance, all eyes turned as one upon Mr. Edward Fairchild, the disinherited cousin. His dark features flushed, and he met our gaze with sullen defiance. "It was he!" cried Lionel, pointing with a trembling hand. "Who else could descend to such devilry? He has hated me since childhood, envying every advantage I possessed. This is his vengeance." The servants muttered in agreement, emboldened by the revelation. Even I, recalling the tale of disinheritance, felt the force of the accusation. The cousin stood rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You wrong me," he said hoarsely. "I would not stoop to trickery." Holmes raised a hand, silencing the rising tumult. His tone was cold and precise. "You are indeed an embittered man, sir, and motive enough may be found in your history. But motive, as I have often remarked, is but one part of the chain. Opportunity and means must join it, else the chain is broken. And here, I perceive, the links are wanting." The cousin's eyes blazed with mingled anger and relief. Holmes' words cast doubt upon the easy conclusion, and I marvelled once again at his refusal to grasp the obvious when the subtle truth lay concealed. Fairchild turned to him in bewilderment. If not he, then who? Holmes's gaze shifted, and I caught in it the gleam of certainty. Yet he withheld his answer, his lips tightening into that enigmatic smile which so often heralded the moment of unmasking. Holmes allowed the silence to deepen before speaking again. His eyes fixed upon Miss Catherine Blythe, who had remained until now half hidden in the shadow of the doorway. She started beneath his gaze, her hands clasping each other tightly. "Miss Blythe," said Holmes evenly, "you were present in the gallery earlier this week, though you denied it. The silk fibre from your glove betrayed you. You touched the banister for support. A trifling act, yet trifles, as I have said before, are the seeds of truth." Her composure faltered. I merely looked in," she stammered. "Curiosity, nothing more." Holmes's voice hardened. "Curiosity armed with turpentine and brushes. Do not insult our intelligence. The contrivance behind that portrait was fed and tended by your hand. You alone possess the freedom to enter unchallenged, the knowledge of the household's habits, and the motive to bring disgrace upon Mr. Fairchild." Lionel recoiled as if struck. "Catherine, this cannot be." Her face blanched, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapse. But pride steadied her, and she lifted her chin defiantly. Yes, I did it. I could not endure the thought of binding myself to a name weighed down by scandal and ruin. Better to end the engagement under a cloud of terror than to endure a lifetime shackled to it. I sought only to frighten you, Lionel, to free myself without reproach. The words fell like stones in the silence. Fairchild's anguish was plain, yet Holmes stood unmoved, his expression as cold as marble. You sought freedom, he said, and allied yourself with resentment. You colluded with the cousin, promising him hope of inheritance if only he lent himself to your play. Between you, the portrait was made to bleed, not by curse, but by avarice and cowardice. The company stared in stunned silence at Holmes's declaration. Then he drew from his pocket a small phial, half filled with a harmless crimson liquid. Holding it aloft, he continued, You sought to continue your charade tonight, Miss Blythe. I anticipated as much. Earlier, when none suspected, I replaced your concoction with this simple dye. What you saw upon the portrait's face was not blood, but my own preparation, devised to reveal you at the very moment of your triumph. A gasp escaped her lips, and her defiance crumbled into despair. You knew, she whispered. Holmes inclined his head. I knew. You betrayed yourself by your glove, by your inconsistent testimony, and by the faint odour of turpentine upon your handkerchief. It required little else to predict that you would attempt one final spectacle to seal your deception. I allowed it, but on my terms. Fairchild, stricken with grief, turned from her with a groan. The cousin muttered bitterly, yet even he seemed awed by Holmes's foresight. I could not restrain my astonishment. Holmes, you played with danger. Had she succeeded? She could not succeed, he interrupted calmly. The game was already lost before she entered the field. I merely allowed her to make the final move, so that none might doubt where the guilt lay. And with that, the matter was ended. The ghost of the bleeding portrait had been laid bare, and the true villain unmasked with Holmes's usual precision and cold mastery. When the hour of reckoning had come, Holmes requested that the household remain in the gallery. Chairs were brought, and by the light of 2 tall lamps, we gathered beneath the brooding portrait of Sir Reginald. Lionel Fairchild sat pale and distraught, his hands clenched upon the arms of his chair. His cousin stood apart, watchful and wary, while Miss Blythe's face betrayed a mixture of pride and apprehension, as though she knew the net had drawn close, but still hoped for some escape. Holmes stood before us with an air of calm authority. His long figure, cast in sharp relief by the lamplight, seemed more like a judge about to deliver sentence than a detective about to explain a puzzle. His manner was not theatrical, yet the intensity of his gaze compelled every ear to listen. My friends, said he, we have tonight witnessed the supposed miracle of a portrait that bleeds. Some of you, perhaps, are still persuaded that the House of Fairchild lies under a curse. I propose to show you instead that what you beheld was nothing more than a clever device, contrived by human hands for a very human end. I shall place before you, step by step, the evidence that led me to the truth, so that you may judge for yourselves the guilt or innocence of those concerned. He paused, and his keen eyes passed slowly over the company. What you will hear may grieve some of you, but truth, like the surgeon's knife, is often painful though it heals. Let us proceed. Holmes turned towards the painting and with a swift movement laid bare once more the hidden recess behind the frame. Observe, he said, holding up the thin tube and reservoir which he had exposed the night before. This contrivance was cunningly inserted within the woodwork. At intervals, a small measure of liquid was released, trickling down the canvas from apertures so fine as to escape notice unless examined at close range. In the dim light of evening lamps, the effect was ghastly indeed. Red lines that seemed to flow from the painted eyes and to deepen night by night as the reservoir was replenished. He held the tube delicately between finger and thumb. The liquid, as analysis will show, was composed of pigment mixed with animal blood. The turpentine, which clung to the brushes and cloths in yonder recess, betrayed its preparation. Thus, what appeared to be a supernatural manifestation was nothing more than a piece of stagecraft designed to terrify rather than to enlighten. A murmur of astonishment ran through the company. Lionel gave a cry of indignation. To desecrate my grandfather's likeness in such a fashion, it is beyond belief. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Beyond belief, perhaps, to one who cherishes the portrait. But to those driven by ambition or fear, desecration is a trifling matter if it achieves its end. The bleeding portrait was no curse, Mr. Fairchild. It was a lever, a means to move you from your rightful place. The contriver counted upon your terror and upon the gossip of servants to make you surrender without a struggle. I could not restrain my admiration at the lucidity of his explanation. What had seemed a ghastly mystery was laid bare with a simplicity that made one wonder how it could ever have deceived us. Holmes's gaze now turned upon Miss Blythe, who sat erect, her lips pressed tightly together. "We come," said he, "to the matter of access. Who among those present could freely enter the gallery and contrive this nightly spectacle without exciting remark? The cousin here was a convenient scapegoat, and no doubt his embittered history lent colour to suspicion. Yet convenience is not proof. Let us consider the facts." He held up the pale fibre of silk which he had plucked from the banister days before. "This, madam, is from your glove. You denied entering the gallery, yet here is the witness of your presence. Add to this the faint impression of a gloved hand upon the polish, noted by my lens, and we have physical evidence that your words cannot be reconciled with truth." Her face paled, and she made a slight movement as if to speak, but Holmes silenced her with an imperious gesture. "Not yet, for there is more. Upon your handkerchief I detected the unmistakable odour of turpentine, faint but sufficient. You explained it as a chance contact in some studio, yet the brushes and rags hidden behind the portrait were steeped in the same scent. Coincidence does not march so neatly in step with circumstance." Lionel groaned, covering his face in his hands, while his cousin stared in mute astonishment. Holmes's voice grew colder. "You played a dangerous part, Miss Blythe, concealing your presence, fabricating ignorance, and pressing upon your betrothed the demand that the terror must cease. Your denial was the last mask of guilt, and like all masks, it slipped at the first touch of fact." Holmes allowed the silence to linger before continuing, his voice steady and deliberate. "We have spoken of means and opportunity. Let us now address motive. No crime is complete without it, and here motive is writ large. Miss Blythe, you found yourself bound to a man whose family name you feared would soon be tainted by scandal. To break the engagement openly would have brought disgrace upon yourself, your family, and your reputation. A lady does not cast aside her betrothed without consequence, particularly when society peers so eagerly into the affairs of others." He turned slightly, his eyes moving from Lionel to the cousin and back again. "And so, you contrived to dissolve the bond without appearing the cause. By clothing your scheme in the garb of the supernatural, you hoped to drive Mr. Fairchild from his inheritance, or at the very least, to render his household so intolerable that the engagement must dissolve of its own accord. At the same time, you offered his cousin a shadow of hope, the promise of advantage should Lionel falter. Thus, in one stroke, you sought both escape and profit." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "It was an alliance of convenience, your fear of scandal and his thirst for restitution. But such partnerships seldom last, for one partner always overreaches and the other betrays." At this, Miss Blythe covered her face, while Lionel groaned as if the truth itself were a knife. Holmes's words fell like hammer blows, stripping away the last vestiges of doubt. Holmes resumed his explanation with that calm precision which lent weight to every syllable. "Now to the evidence, the trifles which, when combined, form a chain of iron. First, the scent of turpentine upon your handkerchief, faint but unmistakable. It clung also to the brushes hidden within the recess of the portrait. A chance encounter in some artist's studio might explain one, but not both. He produced a small slip of paper from his pocket. Second, the pigment traces upon your glove. Under my lens, I observed particles of vermilion, identical to that which formed the false tears. Gloves may protect the hand, but they too carry the marks of labour. He held up the pale thread once more. Third, the silk fibre from the banister, and the impression of a gloved hand upon the polish. These told me what your words denied, that you had stood in the gallery when you claimed to shun it. His eyes grew keener still. And lastly, your contradictions. You spoke of ignorance, yet in the very phrasing of your denial betrayed a knowledge too exact to be innocent. It is by such slips, Miss Blythe, that the clever unmask themselves. The company stirred uneasily. Even the cousin, who had shared in her scheme, now regarded her with something akin to fear. Lionel's anguish was silent, yet his trembling hands told all. Holmes concluded, "These, combined, form a proof so complete that not even your bravest denial could withstand it." The bleeding portrait was no curse, no miracle. It was the handiwork of one who feared scandal more than truth. As Holmes ceased speaking, a hush fell upon the chamber. I confess my own astonishment was unbounded. Again and again I had marvelled at his deductions, but never had I felt more keenly the gulf that lay between his intellect and my own. What to me had been a chaos of strange effects, to him had been a pattern, clear as daylight. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "your foresight borders upon the miraculous. You foresaw her every move, and yet concealed your certainty until the hour was ripe. How do you endure the strain of such concealment?" He gave a short laugh, devoid of warmth. "It is no strain, my dear Watson, but rather an amusement. The world is quick to whisper of phantoms and curses, and men prefer to believe in the marvellous when the commonplace stares them in the face. To pierce such folly is the only diversion, worth my time." He drew upon his pipe, the faint smoke curling about his sharp features. "It was not the portrait that bled, Watson, only the vanity of men and the folly of women. That, I fear, is a malady no surgeon's knife can cure." I could frame no reply, for his words, though tinged with irony, carried a sombre truth, and so the matter of the bleeding portrait was laid to rest, not by prayer or ritual, but by the unerring eye of Sherlock Holmes. It was with profound relief that I found myself once more within the familiar walls of Baker Street. The fire glowed cheerily in the grate, casting a warm and homely light that was in marked contrast to the sombre chambers of Fairchild Manor. The night's strange events, with their ghastly mingling of trickery and terror, seemed almost like a dream when set against the comfort of our modest sitting room. Holmes stretched himself languidly in his armchair, his long legs extended towards the fire. I busied myself with the kettle, for after such an ordeal there is no tonic more restorative than a strong cup of tea. Yet even as I poured, my mind was haunted by the crimson lines that had stained the portrait and by the anguish of those whose lives had been so shaken by deception. There is a curious stillness that follows the resolution of a mystery. One feels both weary and restless, eager to reflect and yet reluctant to probe too deeply, as though fearing to disturb the fragile calm. In that mood, I sat opposite my friend, grateful for the familiar rhythm of his presence, yet filled with questions I scarcely knew how to frame. "My dear Watson," said Holmes presently, breaking the silence, "it is an instructive example of man's appetite for the marvellous. A few streaks of paint, a whiff of turpentine, and behold, an ancient curse is revived, and a household trembles." I could not help but smile at his tone, though my thoughts were less amused. And yet, Holmes, I cannot dismiss the feeling of dread it inspired. For a moment, even I, who should know better, half believed in the supernatural. Perhaps our minds are less governed by reason than we flatter ourselves to think. Holmes inclined his head, the faintest suggestion of amusement upon his lips. Precisely. It is that weakness which the cunning exploit. Where reason falters, fear reigns supreme, and it is my peculiar business to pierce such mists with a little clear light. I shook my head, marvelling at the confidence with which he spoke, while recalling how very nearly I had succumbed to the illusion. You make it sound simple, Holmes, yet I assure you it was anything but to the rest of us. He gave a short laugh. Simplicity, Watson, is always invisible until it has been explained. Holmes drew slowly upon his pipe, the glow of the embers lighting his sharp profile. Mark it well, Watson, said he at last. The portrait did not bleed, nor could it ever. What bled was human folly, the vanity of men who cling to their privileges, and the folly of women who seek to escape consequence by deception. Between them, they contrived a phantom where none existed, and very nearly succeeded in making the world believe it flesh and blood. I could not but smile at his dry summation, though there was a weight of truth beneath the jest. He leaned back in his chair, the smoke curling lazily upward, and for a moment there was silence save for the crackle of the fire. I knew the case had already been consigned to his cabinet of solved puzzles, another thread in the tapestry of his singular career. As the evening wore on, Holmes reached idly for the post, which had lain unopened upon the mantel. He slit one envelope with his long forefinger, scanning its contents with the same swift intensity he devoted to all things. A faint gleam of interest lit his eyes. "It seems, Watson," he remarked, "that London has no intention of allowing us repose. Here is a communication from Whitechapel, a most curious affair involving a vanished tradesman and a series of inexplicable markings upon his shop door. The matter promises both intrigue and danger." I set down my cup with renewed eagerness, for the chill of our late adventure had scarcely worn away before I felt the old thrill of anticipation. Whatever the shadows of Fairchild Manor had left upon my mind, they were already giving way to the prospect of new mysteries, and to the unfailing brilliance of my remarkable companion. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling lazily upward. "You see, Watson, men will summon phantoms from the grave when it spares them from facing the living truth. The portrait did not bleed. Only human vanity and folly bled through its canvas. That, my friend, is the true curse." I sat in silence, pondering his words. And now I put a question to you. What do you think was the fiancée's gravest mistake? Her deceit, her pride, or her belief that Holmes would not uncover it? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, and share this story with friends who love a good puzzle. The next case may already be at Baker Street's door.